Welcome to the Higher Ed Huddle, where we discuss the most relevant topics in higher ed today. I'm your host, Joe Traino, and on today's episode, Al Williams is joining me in a conversation about technology shared services. Al works for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Office of Technology Services and Security as a Deputy Chief Service Officer. Previously, Al worked at the Commonwealth in roles including CIO of Massasoit Community College and as an IT lead for the Department of Higher Education in the Executive Office of Education. Al attended Lehigh for his undergraduate degree. He has an MBA from the University of Baltimore and a doctorate of education from Benedictine University. Al states his own views and opinions and is not representing any perspectives of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Welcome, Al. I'm excited to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Joe. I'm glad to be here and excited as well.
Good. In this episode, we're going to discuss your insights and perspectives regarding shared services and any key takeaways for leaders. I'm excited about this topic. Obviously, I have a great interest in shared services, and I'm really interested in hearing your perspective. So I thought we could just get started and maybe talk about what shared services is. How would you describe shared services?
I typically, Joe, look at them as, you're consolidating some services that you're presenting to the rest of the organization that can be consumed by multiple entities of that organization. So that's typically, it's kind of a simple view, but how I look at shared services.
And these can be any type of services, right? Not necessarily IT. These could be business services, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people say back end, the financial HR type functions. But yeah, it clearly doesn't have to be IT. Clearly IT makes sense. Now, that being said, I wouldn't say all of IT should necessarily be a shared services. I kind of view more infrastructure type IT services as really being more open to being commoditized and to also being a shared service where you get a little closer to the business and applications that maybe a little less of a shared service in that kind of a model. But clearly it could be IT and some other functions as you mentioned.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And certainly shared services is something that's of great interest currently in higher education as institutions really are struggling with budgets, enrollment. It's impacting their ability to provide specific services or to acquire new services. So looking at ways to reduce the cost or look at more efficient or collaborative ways to provide services to their students or faculty or administrative staff. Are there other reasons that come to mind that you feel this is an important topic right now?
Yeah, Joe, you've covered a lot of them, the efficiencies, economy of scale. I think others are, improving processes, right, in general, where it makes sense, to centralize things or share services. If you can improve those processes, I think that's a very important component of shared services. I also think, if we think about security, one area that you haven't mentioned yet, but security, I think that's a very difficult field right now to attract and retain very qualified candidates. And it's so important. So, I'm part of a very large organization, IT organization in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and we're having trouble, right, managing and attracting that kind of talent. I can't imagine if you're a community college by yourself somewhat, right, not being able to provide perhaps compensation that's commensurate with what, people who want to kind of maximize their income. It's very difficult to compete with those resources. So I think that's another big attraction today of shared services is being able to staff an appropriate level of expertise to provide the services that are needed. And as you pointed out, schools today, it's almost like I have a lot of manufacturing experience, and we used to measure downtime, right, in hundreds of thousands of dollars per minute. Well, schools are getting like that, right? Without certain, if a network is down or an application is down, the ability to teach, some things you talked about, to enroll students, to have students be able to pay their bills and things like that, you can bring that all to a grinding halt. So it's, it's that infrastructure, that ability to kind of keep things operating is so much more important. So the more efficient and more effective that you can be in doing that, that's the value driver for why we do these things now, I think, in IT.
Yeah. Yeah, I like those examples. Certainly around security, I can see some of the benefits of sharing resources, sharing knowledge, information sharing, maybe in some type of services model. I think would go hand in hand quite well. What do you think some of the challenges are of a shared services model or agreement or collaboration?
I think a lot still stem with typical change management type things, right? It's generally not the technology; it's generally the people and processes around that. So people who have kind of run things, themselves, or you have kind of an autonomous service model right now. People are a little hesitant to kind of centralize that and lose control. Or is this centralized or shared services team? Are they really going to know our business as well as we do? So I think those are some of what I would consider some of the challenges. And then another one, this is to me just math that you figure it out, but a big stumbling block sometimes is just how do you charge for those services too, right? How do you fairly charge for all the services that are being shared? I know in IT sometimes that we can kind of get bogged down in some of those discussions, but I think it's just, it just takes time and the right people to figure things out.
You were talking about some of the challenges, and one of the things that we hear sometimes is the word consolidation, and I don't know if it's so much that individuals look at a shared services or a collaborative type of model, if they look at that as consolidation. And so, consolidation has this moniker of a bad thing, because people immediately think that, oh, we're going to eliminate positions. How would you, respond to that? Or what are your thoughts about the word consolidation? Do you see it tied to shared services as much as, maybe we see in the news, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Joe. So I view them as somewhat distinct, right? Where consolidation to me connotes a little more accountability and authority over the service. Where if you use a word more like collaboration, that C word is more, well, it's good, right? I can reach out, I could listen, I can get different perspectives, but then I can do whatever the heck I want anyway, right? And I think there's applicability for those two things in the right things. When it comes to security, and again, I'll focus there, Joe, if you don't mind, but this is where I think consolidation makes a little bit more sense, because we know there are best business practices by people who have, that's what they bring to the party, right? That's their competency is security. That's all they do, and it changes so quickly. So I think that's why when you're centralizing something and you're giving accountability for that being managed to someone else, that makes sense in that particular regard. Now, again, it's change management. People have to, moving from A to B, take some change management to get there. But that's why I think consolidation can be a good thing. I understand it as a negative thing if people are controlling things just for the sake of control. But when I view control around security, it's really ensuring that we have the right people doing the right things around security, from a policy perspective, from how the packets are inspected in and out of an organization. I don't think there's a lot of variance on how that should be done properly from a security perspective anymore, right? And so let's have people do that who know how to do it and do it well and can keep up with things and can, again, back to what we said previously, attract and retain the people needed to do that. So that's where I think where consolidation makes more sense versus collaboration. Security is one of those few places I don't know if you could collaborate yourself to greatness, to be quite honest. It's a little easier to consolidate yourself to greatness, right, from a security posture perspective. But I think there's other areas where collaboration may make more sense, but not, I think, when we're talking about how to design a network, how to design telecommunications, how to design security policies today. Those are, I think, there is a better way to approach it, and I think the quicker you can move to that, the more secure, the more efficient, and more effective you'll be. I think consolidation, especially if you're looking at it more as a control type thing, in a good way, makes sense for things like security. I'm not a big believer that you can collaborate your way to greatness when it comes to the security realm, right? Just because it's so complicated, it's evolving so much. And so to me, to have a service of people that can keep, that's their core competency, they can keep current with that and manage that across multiple entities is a much better way than collaboration. Now, again, I don't want to give collaboration a bad name either. That makes a lot of sense in certain cases, but it's like anything else, right? I think we're learning, like with leadership, there's no one way to do it right. Generally, it depends upon the situation, and then your leadership or your security, it depends upon the situation you're talking about. So again, I think consolidation makes sense with security. Collaboration makes sense in other areas. That's how I view the difference between them. You need to do both, and you apply them where it makes the most sense.
Yeah, I like that. I like that analogy, and I agree with you. I think the consolidation piece on security, I think, is a great fit. And I think about not so much that, staff are, having responsibilities taken away from them. They are. However, I think there are certain services that really lend themselves well to a single entity really overseeing those particular services for a group of members, for example. And I'm just using a really simple example here. And I think what it does is it frees up those resources to work on other things that doesn't require day in, day out type of attention. And so they can maybe focus on more strategic items from a security standpoint. And I think that consolidation works really well. And I like the collaboration piece that you mentioned about really other areas outside of security. And certainly from an ERP standpoint, there's a potential for a lot of collaboration. So is there any thoughts that you have regarding, consolidation or collaboration in a system or a non-system area? So when we think about some states have schools that are in districts or a part of a system, and then there's others that are very independent. But we've seen, collaboration, consolidation, perhaps with MOUs or type of agreements that allow them to work together. But do you see any differences or any benefits to being in a system versus not being in a system? What are some thoughts around that you have?
Yeah, most of my experience, Joe, is in a public school system of higher education. You have community colleges and state schools, and then perhaps some universities associated with that. And, I think that's a great model for both consolidation and collaboration. Right? And I know we're talking mostly about IT, but, there's a lot of non-IT areas where that makes sense, right? I know there are some states, and I don't have a huge exposure to other states, but I do know what happens in some other states, right? Where sometimes if you're at that community college system and you're taking biology 101, and then you want to move on to your 4-year degree, all those prerequisites may not, apply right towards the 4-year degree when you go into the state school. And so there's obviously an area where, let's make sure that, when we have a student, we're preparing them for maybe a 4-year degree, and maybe they're at a 2-year degree. Let's make sure that, the 2+4 system or the 2+2 system works towards that bachelor's degree, and that all the courses make sense. So I think there's an area, just like with IT, that there's areas that student registration. I know in the Commonwealth that I'm in, if you go to 3 different schools, you probably have 3 different student IDs. That's not the way it should work, right? That's just not commonsensical. From a school perspective, we want to know Al and where he's been and what credits he has and how we could put that all together to map out a plan, what makes sense for him, not for Al to tell us, all the courses and this mismatch of stuff, and that we didn't even know he was a student in 2 other places. And IT is no different, right? And IT actually is, I think, a good enabler of those kind of things, so that you can have the technology managing those things, so that the student experience is much more seamless and much easier around helping them get to whatever outcomes they want to get to from their education. And so I think security in a system should be fairly standard, right? You have one network. I know it's kind of a nice moniker, right? But you're using one network with all these underlying infrastructures and vendors. It's very difficult to manage security vendors, to be quite honest, at least my experience, right? And that's a special talent of being able to manage that. And so you have someone doing that across many schools, ensuring that there is there's a shared infrastructure that is very secure. So now individual schools may need to do that. I don't have as much experience there, but I think it's a little harder for them to do that, right? Because they can't take advantage of economies of scale as much, right? They have to compete, for a CISO. If they want their own CISO, that is not an easy person to find and hire and retain these days. I think when you have a kind of a shared service that is benefiting from an economy of scales and benefiting the talents of a CISO or CISOs, and leveraging that across a broader base is a much better model. Not just from a cost perspective, right? We used to always think about these things of doing it just from a cost efficiency, but and there is that, but from a security perspective, I think it's more from an effectiveness and leveraging good talent, good, hard to find talent that isn't readily available across as many institutions as possible makes sense.
Yeah, don't you think that doing it that way, they all benefit from the expertise of a model like that versus individual school that has a fantastic CISO, but being able to, and there may be institutions that can't afford a CISO, for example, and so in that shared services model that you were describing, having a CISO that's shared amongst all the institutions, or maybe it's a team of CISOs providing those services, they all benefit from it, right? So they're able to benefit more together than they could on their own or individually. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I'm not trying, the Commonwealth I'm in, very autonomous. The schools, their own board of trustees, don't really even report up to the executive offices of how we manage things. And there are very good people there, but it's just difficult to get and retain that kind of talent that you need. And Joe, as you just said, so when you have that and you can leverage it just makes sense. And a lot of times security isn't that, when you talk about ERP, there's much more nuances the closer you get to the classroom. But with security, that's not necessarily the case, right? And so I just think the functionality or that service opens itself. It's easier to leverage too to begin with. Not only does it make sense to do that, but it's a little easier to do that than some of the other things we've discussed in higher education.
Yeah, good point. We've been talking about security being an easy win for shared services, or at least an easy target for shared services. Are there other services that you feel are very suitable to a shared services model?
I think networking is another area where it makes sense to leverage that that understanding across shared services, telecommunications, call center technology. I'm not sure. I used to say this about invoicing systems. It's hard to get a competitive advantage from an invoicing system, right? Invoicing is invoicing, and it's very important. It's a very important function, but it's not an area where you want to spend your time to differentiate that much more than anybody else's, because the return on that investment probably isn't there. But when we're talking about telecommunications, call center, to me, it's almost, and I know that a lot of people in IT don't like when we say commoditized, but any service that's commoditized, I think managing servers, data centers, that all falls under the cost efficiency, cost effectiveness model, kind of providing that infrastructure upon which then you can really go nuts with the applications, right? And where you can really, tailor things, right? Another C word I have to be careful with, but customize or configure things where you can really drive some advantage to what you're trying to do at your school. But most other things, I would say, would be a good shared services from an IT perspective.
No, I can appreciate that. It makes sense to me, and I'm sure it's making sense to our listeners. So here's the $64,000 question. How do we get states and districts and other systems of higher ed to consider more collaboration or more partnerships around shared services?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is not the easy answer, but what makes the most sense about how do you justify anything, right? It should be justified on the value. What's the value driver of this project or what we're trying to do? And I think when it comes to security, the value driver is getting a little easier to quantify, right? Because unfortunately, schools are getting hit with distributed denial of service attacks, ransomware. So obviously, the value can be that if we can show a model or a shared service that can really improve our posture or lower our risk to these kind of things, that should be a driver, and that's where you should start. That's why you do these things. You don't consolidate just for the sake of consolidating, right? And you don't want to. That's not how you approach it. You approach it more from, listen. There are numerous examples. There's best business practices around how this could probably best be managed at this time. And so let's look at that, and then let's build a case around what the ideal should look like, what that shared service might look like, and then understanding where people are, and then you just kind of do the analysis of kind of getting people from point A to point Z. Now, understand that there's maybe you can't always get from A to Z. You might have to go from A to D to whatever it might be, but I think it's important to start out with what that ideal looks like and the value that ideal brings and gets everyone invested. And then just other things would be obviously some strong executive sponsorship around that, because it's easy for me to say to do this. It's not typical, it's like on the private sector that, them going through an ERP effort, they're very difficult to do. I think the failure rate was over 50% at one point. At least wow. I know that was true in the chemical process industries back in the 90s. So it's a difficult project. So you have to make sure you have, you have good project methodology in place when you're doing it. So that's how it should be done. What's interesting is sometimes that still doesn't get everybody there, right? And I do know some states have started to kind of legislate consolidation, right? We don't need all this administration to manage all these schools, and we're going to consolidate a lot of these what we call shared services, right? The Commonwealth that I'm involved in right now, actually, there is a legislation around consolidating some IT for the executive offices in the Commonwealth. Now, I think the legislation came about because of the value drive, right? There was a reason behind doing this. But sometimes it's good to have that kind of, backing. Talk about a sponsorship for getting things done. Well, having a legislative act to help you do this can be very helpful, right? Because this is difficult. It's difficult to get people to this point if they're not on board with it to begin with. So I do think it's. So another thing too, Joe, which might be helpful, and I'm sorry to kind of just be brainstorming some ideas or throwing out some ideas, but I think there's still a little bit of, if your school is attacked in some capacity, right? There's a lot of things you have to follow there's a lot of privacy laws and legislation, especially outside of the US, that you have to conform to. But there is a propensity to, if I don't have to really disclose something, I'm a little hesitant to do so, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's, one is for good reason, right? You're a little worried about if the public, right? Nefarious forces in the public find out that you're somewhat susceptible. It might make you more of a target than you already are. Right. I understand that. But then there's also the part of, I don't want to expose my dirty laundry in public. And we have to get past that, right? We have to, let people know, let school systems know that you are a target and you will never be 100% secure, but there are ways to be much more secure than you are. And there's a lot of things going on that you may not know about. Schools not having their systems available, paying ransom, things of that sort. I think if presidents of schools or whoever the CIO is reporting to, perhaps the CFO, or even the board of these schools knew the extent of what really is going on and the impact that it can have to their business, I think that would help them understand, that's a value driver in making that not happen. But if you don't know it's that big an issue, why would you have so many other things to worry about? So it has to be a priority to people outside of IT to help make these things happen too and drive these kind of efforts going forward.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think about the institutions that have had breaches. It's painful to have that information public or known, right? Mm-hmm. Not just from an institutional reputation standpoint, but really the leadership that's there. That's embarrassing, especially from a IT leadership standpoint, or maybe even the president. However, sometimes that's what it takes for there to be action or movement in a direction that really helps other institutions prevent or at least increase their posture, their cybersecurity posture, in a way that maybe delays or reduces the chances that they're going to have the same thing happen. And I say that because it's hard to convince others to come together and either give up a little bit of control or have to pay into a shared services model to take advantage of it. But I think, to your point, there is a lot of value, and I think if you can show the value of a system or a model, I think anyone that's in a leadership role will see the benefit and the value in doing it, and they would be supportive. I can't imagine people not being supportive of this or a model that would benefit or help improve their security posture. And we're just, strictly speaking about security.
Yeah.
So I'm
sorry, Joe. I think another big component of this too is, I don't want to make this is not one-sided at all, right? So IT, when they're doing shared services or becoming more of a shared services organization, they have to learn and grow and understand what it means to really be a customer service oriented organization, right? And I know there's a lot of people would say that has never been, may have not been the IT strong point to begin with. So that's also, as whoever's providing those services, right? Whether it's finance, HR, whoever the shared services provider is, they have to be very cognizant of what it means to be a customer service organization and what you have to do to, make sure that your customers view you in that light. So not only does it, make sense to do that, but the how you do it is very important too, right? And you don't want people moving away from a central or a shared service model where it makes sense just because the service was poor. That's not the right reason, right? Or you should move away from the right model. You should fix what's wrong in the model before abandoning it. But sometimes that's how organizations move instead.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's so many different examples. Consolidation, collaboration, shared services. It's been around for many, many years, as you know. I can recall maybe 20 years ago, there was a mandate from a chancellor for a system to look at ways to be more efficient and effective as a system. And they looked at IT and they looked at all the different services and where there's opportunities to collaborate or take advantage of economies of scale. And so, the concept has been around for decades, but we're not seeing as much movement in that direction. And I often wonder why. And maybe, it's not as simple as just, banding together and working together. I think there's more nuance, there's more variables associated with. I think in the beginning of our discussion, you mentioned how do you look at charging for services if you were to consolidate to a shared services entity, for example. So there's a lot of different components, and obviously there's politics involved in this, and I think the independence piece, I think, is certainly a big piece of it as well. So, but I think I'm starting to see a trend in the direction of, collaboration, a little bit of consolidation, maybe a shared way of thinking, and I like it. I think it's good. I think it'll be good for higher ed, certainly in the IT space. Maybe even on the business side, you can see some opportunities to standardize what the student experience is, enrollment or financial aid or the business office, for example.
Yeah, no, Joe, I still think, in higher education, we're still talking about accessibility and affordability and quality. Those have been kind of three tenets that I believe, a Secretary of Education more than 50 years ago said were issues that, back then, and I think they're still very prevalent today. And so, again, I think we want to do these things for the right reasons for students, right? But it's a myriad of things, right? I think like cost effectiveness is still a very big driver around what we could do in IT. As you said, we know that, we're in a long cycle of demographics, that there's just not, there won't be as many, college age available people or students coming out of high school over a few years. And, we know that, education affordability is still a very, very big concern, and the amount of debt that students are graduating with. And so anything that we can do to allow schools to be a little bit more flexible with their cost model so that they can, kind of ramp down cost as appropriate when needed, and to make things more affordable, but not reducing the quality of those services. Those are things that we've been talking about for a long time. And I hope that we continue to make sure that those are our focus areas, and we continue to do what we can. Now, I happen to be in IT, so I want to do what I can from an IT perspective to improve student success in our higher education system, right? Again, I think that's the value that we're all trying to work towards and continue to work. There's been amazing, there has been progress, but we just need to obviously continue to hopefully make it a little bit more exponential, perhaps.
Yeah, it's a slow.
We'd all like to see a higher, more slope.
Steeper slope. Yeah, it's been, as we kind of wrap up our time today, I wanted to ask you if you have any lessons learned that you can share around your experience with shared services models. Anything that, any words of wisdom. If I'm an IT leader and I'm thinking about having conversations with other institutions or institutions in my district or system, what are some lessons learned I should be aware of? Anything come to mind?
I'm trying to just be additive or purposeful here, Joe. This is going to sound a little cliche, but still so much of it probably comes down to relationships, as with almost anything, right? And so what do I mean by that? It's just especially in your role, Joe, right? Or as we're trying to kind of communicate this message to a larger audience, it's really just who are the right people that we need to network and form relationships with to help understand, what the risks that are here, and then maybe also that, like you said, and the value that things can drive. This is one of these areas, I think, with certain parts of shared services there, it shouldn't be as hard to sell as it is, right? Because there's not only value, but there's also risk and uncertainty and, very horrible things that can happen. So, we have to make sure that we're working with the right people and delivering this kind of message that can drive this kind of change from, a macro and micro perspective. And I know this is very, very high level motherhood and apple pie, I shouldn't say motherhood, just apple pie, right? Just I'm at a very high level here. But sometimes significant change like this doesn't happen without some significant pain to help guide it. And I hope we don't have to get to that point, right? Where we're having so many attacks and so many issues that's the motivation for us to move. But it's more working at a chancellor level. There's I've been in higher education for a few years, but there are so many good collaborative boards, right? That would, around community colleges or state universities, legislation, maybe even lobbying to some extent. I don't know, but someone needs to help deliver this message at the right levels to the right people, I think, to really drive the change, because this kind of change has to be more revolutionary than evolutionary, because if we keep going kind of the evolutionary perspective, the people that want to do damage to us, that want to ransom our data, that want to make money, will win, right? Because they're motivated. If they're properly resourced, they're motivated. We have to be just as diligent and motivated and proactive as we can be. So I do think it is kind of these relationships at the right levels, at the government, at lobbyists, at organizations, helping to manage things. Accreditation components, really, maybe that this becomes a little bit more of being accredited in the U.S. or even globally, right? There is always a component around information technology, but perhaps maybe we need to look at, is there enough teeth behind that? Mm-hmm. So anyway, I don't mean to go on, but that may be the last thing that I'd probably add that maybe we haven't talked about.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I really, I agree, and I see firsthand the importance of building relationships and really answering the question of what's in it for me and why I should do this, and really helping build a desire for people to want to explore it further, really to understand the value and the benefit of doing it and working together. And I think if you take that direction, I think you're going to be more successful in having really productive conversations and really looking at ways to work together versus just being out there on your island alone, working independently. So,
right. Yeah. And it's not, and this isn't an IT issue, right? And it shouldn't even be approached that way, right? No. This is again, it's a efficiency, effectiveness component, and IT shouldn't be looking at this alone, right? President shouldn't be looking at this alone. It needs to be, again, the proper relationship across both of those. It's a very cross-functional type of thing, and we don't want to address these as IT projects. They're student success projects, right?
Exactly. So helping build a better student experience.
Exactly.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me today and sharing your insights on shared services. This has been fantastic. I certainly feel there's a lot here for our listeners to consider, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks. You can find our podcast on SoundCloud, Google, and Apple iTunes. Check back next month for another great topic and a great guest. Until then, stay well.